Following their victories in the European theater and later Pacific theater, the United States of America and her allies were left with the remnants of the Axis navies, namely the German Kriegsmarine, the Italian Regia Marina, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, of which, in the time-honored tradition of victorious nations, the Allies divided up those remnants between them, with the Americans receiving some of the few remaining capital ships left to the Axis powers. In today's video, we will go over some of the larger vessels acquired by the United States following the Second World War and their respective fates. Starting off with one that caused some confusion in the past, but it would be wrong if I didn't discuss her again, as she was one of the last major warships left to the Kriegsmarine, Prinz Eugen. Our story with Prinz Eugen begins back in mid-1944 after recommissioning in 1943 and joining the Fleet Training Group. If you want to learn more about the decommissioning of all heavy units, I'll link to the playlist for this series. Anyway, in June 1944, Prinz Eugen patrolled the Finnish coast north of the island of Uto in a show of strength to cover the German withdrawal when Finland was going to leave the war. In July, there wasn't much of anything to note for her service. In August, however, there was quite a bit of action, as off Kurland in the Gulf of Riga, the cruiser spent 265 rounds of her main battery, 20.3cm or 8-inch guns on Soviet positions at Tukum, a rail and road junction about 25 kilometers inland, while our escorting destroyers and torpedo boats engaged other targets. On the 2nd of September, she returned to Finland following the nation bowing out of the war. In mid-October, the ship sailed to Gottenhofen, today what is Gdynia in Poland, for 5 days and attacked a little under 30 targets in the defense of the Baltic coast near Memel, expending almost 1,200 rounds of her main battery guns in company with another heavy cruiser that had recommissioned, the Lutzow, formerly the Deutschland. On the return to Gottenhofen on the night of the 15th at full speed, Prinz Eugen ran the light cruiser Leipzig, which was adrift while making a routine engine coupling transfer. Both ships remained locked together until the next day. Leipzig, although heavily damaged, remained afloat. While Prinz Eugen lost a section of her bow, she returned to Gottenhofen yards, where thanks to personal initiative of the naval senior architect, Professor Burkhardt, the same man who had designed the class, a new stem was added on in a few days and tested on the 14th of November. The cruiser was again operational, and on the 20th, in company with the torpedo boats T-21, T-13, T-16, and T-19, bombarded Soviet positions near the Swob Peninsula. After this, she returned to Gottenhofen again, where she was scheduled for a refit and rebore of her guns. The refit work was completed on January 15th, and only 2 weeks later, Prinz Eugen and torpedo boats covered the breakout of the 28th Corps from the bridgehead at Krens, Königsberg, where in the defense of these troops, she expended a further 871 rounds of her main battery guns. Still, the Soviet advance could not be stopped by her own or other German guns. Through the coming months of winter and spring 1945, Prinz Eugen covered the retreating German army around the Baltic, much like other ships we have discussed like the Lutzow, Admiral Hipper, and Admiral Scheer. On March 7th, the Soviets advanced on the cities of Danzig, Gdynia, and Hel. Prinz Eugen was involved in the defense of those cities from March 10th on. In the defense of those cities, a total of 2,025 rounds of 20.3cm and 2,446 15cm shells were fired by the various ships involved in the defense. During this period, Prinz Eugen also supported the old pre-dreadnought Schlesien and later the repaired Leipzig. After Hel had been evacuated and abandoned in mid-April, Prinz Eugen eventually retired to Copenhagen on April 19th, joining the light cruiser Nürnberg, where to quote Aidan Dodson and Serena Kant in Spoils of War, the fate of the enemy fleets after 2 world wars. A considerable number of German vessels were in Danish waters at the time of the surrender, in particular, those involved in the Baltic evacuations. Considerable friction resulted when Danish elements attempted to board German vessels, the latter's crews not recognizing the Danes as victors, only the British to whom they had formerly surrendered under the May 5th agreement. Apart from the big ships, the replenishment ship Nordmark, together with T-47, T-107, T-108, and T-151, and other smaller vessels, had been at Copenhagen on the 7th. On May 7th, both cruisers were taken over by the Royal Navy in the coming days. On May 7th, both cruisers were taken over by the Royal Navy. In the coming days, the two ships were escorted to Wilhelmshaven by the cruisers Devonshire and Dido, arriving in the harbor locks on the 26th of May. Prinz Eugen was lodged in the 40,000-ton floating dock in the city, but since all of her ammunition had already been shipped at Copenhagen, little else remained to be done to the heavy cruiser. On June 2nd, after a final commander's parade, a large contingent of the crew was disembarked, and those remaining aboard were subjected to close watch. Nevertheless, many objects of traditional or historical value were smuggled off the ship. During this period of being laid up, the cruiser was visited by numerous high-ranking Royal Navy officers. It proved a magical attraction, especially for naval engineers of Western powers. The remains of the German fleet were to be divided amongst the victorious powers. For example, the cruiser Nürnberg and the gunnery target ship Hessen were eventually ceded to the Soviet Union. Prinz Eugen, on the other hand, was the creme de la creme of the remaining surface units, and everybody wanted her. The USSR, because of its attempts to purchase the vessel in 1939 and a sort of prize for the bombardment of its forces over the last year of the war, the British wanted her in part for her role in sinking HMS Hood, and the Americans wanted her for the technology, if that's to be believed. There are some sources that say the United States didn't even want the ship, and one of the only reasons to have her was to keep her away from the Soviets. After much debate on how to decide who got the ships, lots were drawn. The lots were Lot X, which was Prinz Eugen, one Type 1936A destroyer and 5 other destroyers/torpedo boats; Lot Y, which was Nürnberg, 4 Type 1936A destroyers, 6 other destroyers/torpedo boats; Lot Z, 8 Type 1936A destroyers, 5 other destroyers and torpedo boats. To take from Dodson Crank again, it was not until October 29th that the British were prepared to go ahead based on the luck of the draw. And later that day, the draw took place. To the consternation of the British and the Soviets, both keen to get Prinz Eugen, Lot X fell to the Americans. Lot Y went to the USSR, and Z to the UK. This result was enshrined in the final report of the TNC, signed December 6, 1945. The Americans won, and on December 14, 1945, Prinz Eugen arrived at Bremerhaven, then an American enclave within the British zone of occupation. On January 5, 1946, Prinz Eugen was commissioned into the United States Navy under the designation IX-300 to designate that she was a war prize, but retaining the name Prinz Eugen. She left German waters that day for Britain. To sail her there and for technical investigations of her machinery and other technologies, a large part of her German crew was retained and remustered aboard, particularly the weapons specialist, signal navigation specialist, underwater acoustic staff, and engine room staff. These were important because the Americans weren't well versed in the high-pressure hot steam plant. Dodson and Kant have this to say: although both Nagato and Sakawa sailed with U.S. crews, both did not get commissioned. However, Prinz Eugen was commissioned under her original name, and the hull number was IX-300. On January 5, 1946, with a composite American-German crew, she sailed from Wesemunde for Boston in January, arriving on the 22nd. The cruiser was examined on arrival, a number of her components being removed for trials and further analysis. Her passive sonar being installed in USS Flying Fish. The guns of the foremost turret were removed at Philadelphia in February, together with 2 105mm mountings, a set of torpedo tubes, light AA guns, and several rangefinders. The cruiser arrived off the United States East Coast in late January, arriving in Boston on the 23rd, and then on to Philadelphia, leaving on February 11th for the Panama Canal, which she transited on the 15th. Once in the Pacific, a comprehensive examination of the hydrophones was undertaken, and the cruiser called in San Pedro on March 24th. From April 10th to May 1st, the torpedoes were thoroughly investigated. When the German crew was no longer needed, contingents of the German crew were disembarked in 3 groups, and on May 1st, Captain Reinecke and the remainder of the crew were landed on May 1st, 1946. The Americans subsequently had some serious problems with the cruiser's machinery. A breakdown of all but one boiler on the passage from San Diego to Hawaii. The cruiser was brought with tug assistance to Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands via Honolulu. On July 1st, 1946, the first post-war atom bomb test was carried out on a group of 11 warships, including the heavy cruiser. Prinz Eugen proved resilient to the blast, and there was little damage aboard the ship, this being testable, although all animals were killed aboard the vessel. To take from heavy cruisers of the Admiral Hipper class, warships of the Kriegsmarine by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke, they write, "The second A device exploded on July 25th was an underwater bomb, Test Baker. The ship remained afloat, but was heavily irradiated. As a result, the intention to repair and recommission her was abandoned, and the hull was towed to Kwajalein Atoll and anchored. Because of the long period she spent in tropical waters, the stuffing glands and outboard vents of the ship began to leak, and on December 22nd she capsized. There the wreck lies today, minus various parts removed before the tests. The ship's bell hangs in the Navy Museum, Washington, the Tegethoff bell is displayed at Graz, and one of the two propellers was obtained by the German Navy League in 1979 and mounted in front of the Naval Memorial at Le Beau. The heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen and the light cruiser Nürnberg were the only two major German warships to survive the war, undamaged, and passed to the victors at capitulation. I should mention that we will cover minor vessels in a further video, whether that's German, Italian, or Japanese, or maybe a minor power. With that being said, let's look at another two major war prizes that the Americans got at the end of the war, the Japanese cruiser Sakawa and the battleship Nagato. Of the remaining vessels, we'll look at Nagato first. She was originally laid down in August 1917, armed with 8 16-inch guns, and with a top speed in excess of 26 knots. She was a powerful battleship, especially for her day, and with further reconstructions and refits, she continued to be a useful ship for the Imperial Japanese Navy throughout the interwar period right into the Second World War, where she saw service first as the flagship for the combined fleet. In this capacity, it was from her decks that the orders to start the Pacific War were issued, where, to be honest, her wartime service isn't all that exciting until about 1944, where to take from Mark Still in the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific War. After the Japanese defeat at the Philippine Sea, Nagato returned to Japan for refit and repair. By July, it had returned to Linga and was now assigned to Force A of the 1st Striking Force. Nagato and 6 other of the IJN's battleships departed Linga on October 18th to attack the American invasion force at Leyte. On October 24th, Nagato suffered 2 near misses in the morning, and in the afternoon, it was hit by 2 bombs and experienced 3 near misses. Damage was light, but the ship's speed was impaired temporarily. Force A came upon the 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3. For the first time of the war, Nagato used her guns in anger, opening fire at 20 miles. Overall, she played a minor role in the battle and damaged one of the escorting destroyers. While she retired, she was struck by 2 more bombs, of which one destroyed her anchor deck. Overall, despite the aerial attacks over the 2-day period, her damage was light. After Leyte Gulf, Nagato returned to Japan in November 1944, and with no fuel available, she was modified for use as a floating anti-aircraft battery and was assigned to Yokosuka Naval District. In April 1945, Nagato was reassigned once again, this time as a reserve ship. She was stripped of her remaining 5.5-inch guns and almost all of her anti-aircraft guns, which were removed to a nearby mountain. The crew was reduced to 1,000 men, and Nagato was heavily camouflaged, with her main guns covered with scaffolding and trees placed upon her upper decks. This effort in camouflaging was for naught, as she was subjected to carrier air attacks on July 18, 1945. 1 bomb hit the bridge, causing heavy casualties, and another hit after the mainmast. This was the only damage, and in this condition, Nagato was the last surviving Japanese battleship of the war, and on August 30th, 1945, she was boarded and taken over by the United States Navy. Moving briefly over to Sakawa, she was a light cruiser built during the Second World War, being completed in late November 1944, being armed with 3 twin 6-inch guns, plenty of AA guns, especially the 25mm morale boosters, a 35-knot top speed, and, interestingly enough, radar. She was assigned to Destroyer Squadron 11 in December 1944, and due to fuel shortages, she was unable to participate in the 10 Ichigo operation, where she remained in the inland sea on training duties until July 1945. She was surrendered intact to the Allied powers. So, with that being said, Nagato and Sakawa were allocated to the United States Navy, and although they sailed with U.S. crews, They were never fully commissioned into the United States Navy, unlike the German cruiser Prinz Eugen. In any case, in early February 1946, Sakawa was taken away from repatriation duty and took on a USN crew, and departed Yokosuka for Enowitak on March 18th. She was accompanied by the Nagato, which had run trials in Tokyo Bay during the past couple of weeks. On the 28th, though, both broke down 300 nautical miles away from their destination and were taken in tow by tugs on the 30th. Sakawa arrived on April 1st, followed by Nagato on the 4th. Both were repaired to a certain extent, just enough to get them to their final destination, Bikini Atoll. Again, taking from Dodson and Kant. There, they became part of a fleet of unwanted vessels to be used as targets for Operation Crossroads, a series of tests to explore the effect of nuclear explosions. Sakawa was moored less than a quarter-mile away from the initial explosion of Test Able. In contrast, Nagato was moored close to a mile away from the explosions. Taking from Bombs at Bikini by William A. Shercliffe, an unusual must, not normally applicable to manned ships, was making the ships almost perfectly watertight. A fact not fully realized by the public is that the majority of warships, even warships which had never been in battle, leak slightly, particularly in older ships. It is almost impossible to make all joints perfectly tight. The slight continual inflow of water is of no consequence ordinarily. It is easily pumped out, but in this operation, where the ships might have to remain for weeks without crews and without pumps operating, such leaks might be very serious. There was some danger that the captured Japanese ships Nagato and Sakawa might actually sink from this cause if they were left unattended for 3 or 4 weeks. In Test Able, Sakawa was severely damaged on July 1st, and she foundered the next day. In contrast, Nagato sustained only superficial damage, but during Test Baker on July 24th, the underwater explosion caused more damage. She was boarded and a boiler activated for 36 hours, but during the night on the 29th, progressive flooding led to the battleship capsizing in 164 feet of water. Again taking from Bombs at Bikini, the ex-Japanese battleship Nagato sank during the night, 4.5 days after Mike Hour. Only a few hours after Mike Hour, she took on a list of about 5 degrees. The list increased so slowly that many observers expected her to survive. When her characteristic silhouette failed to show itself on the morning of July 30th, surprise was general. No one had seen her sink. Undoubtedly, openings had been made in her hull, of which the wreck is still down there, and like the cruiser Prinz Eugen, people like to dive it. There's some excellent pictures online, really worth a Google. Now, the Regia Marina was in an interesting position as in 1943, the Italian government had torn away from their German allies to turn to the invading Allied powers, and with that, a period of co-belligerency with the Allied powers began. However, for a vast majority of the remainder of the Second World War, the major surface vessels of the Regia Marina were inactive in Allied-controlled ports, notably the remaining battleships of the Littorio class, Italia and Vittorio Veneto, with their sister Roma being sunk by German-guided bombs in September 1943. To stray away from the complex negotiations, the Italian government signed a peace treaty in Paris in 1947, which came into effect on September 15th of that year, in which the once powerful Italian navy was going to be broken up, the Allied powers such as France, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and of course the United States receiving ships. Under the provisions of the treaty, the Italian Navy would retain 2 battleships, the 2 Andrea Doria-class ships, 4 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 13 torpedo boats, 20 corvettes, 8 smaller boats, and a range of auxiliary vessels. Excess vessels beyond those limits were to be placed at the disposal of the nations previously mentioned. The vessels that were to be handed over needed to be fully equipped, in operational condition, including a full outfit of armament stores, and complete with onboard spare parts and all necessary technical data. The big question to answer is, what ships did everyone want? Well, other nations like Greece and Yugoslavia wanted smaller vessels like destroyers, with Greece receiving 2 light cruisers and a third for cannibalization, while Yugoslavia got several torpedo boats. Now, France received some of Italy's most interesting vessels of the Capitani Romani class, like Attila Regolo, Pompeo Magno, and Scipio Africano, and some other smaller craft. The Soviets received the elderly battleship Giulio Cesare, even though their ambitions earlier were to receive a Littorio-class ship. They did receive other ships like cruisers, submarines, and destroyers. Now, the Americans and British were very eager to each get their hands on a Littorio-class vessel, with the British to receive Vittorio Veneto, and the United States to receive the Italia, the former Littorio, and of course smaller craft. The British had some consideration for reactivation of the Italian ship, as their fleet was becoming rather old by 1947, with Vanguard of course being the newest battleship. But as we learned in my Fates of the Littorio class video, Vittorio Veneto would be scrapped, while the United States declaration was rather interesting. The USA made its announcement on October 5th, stating that it wished its allocation of vessels to be scrapped and utilized as a contribution to the continued recovery of the Italian economy. However, at this point, the list of which nation would receive what had not been made available to Italy, and while the British had now made a decision in principle to waive for scrap all but Vittorio Veneto and 3 of the MTBs, no announcement was yet forthcoming. One concern of giving up the battleship was that the Soviets might then raise the idea of a swap of one of the now-to-be scrapped Littorios for their ancient Cesare. The Italians would take their time in scrapping Vittorio Veneto and Italia, hoping to delay for as long as possible as to possibly retain the 2 battleships, at least for training purposes. Nevertheless, they were broken up in the 1950s, with the Soviets asking for a possible swap for the unwanted modern battleships. Thus, the United States did not receive any major warship from the Regia Marina. I think the subject of war prizes is fascinating, and something I would like to discuss more in the future, especially with the submarines, whether Japanese, German, or Italian. The Japanese I-400 class comes to mind. Also, before I forget, we will cover the minor navies, as well as talk about the British later on. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.